pretext for tonight's discussion is the work of Liz Rhodes that I imagine most of you have seen, and the title of this exhibition, which has already puzzled Astra, The Trouble with Image Politics, has been prompted by her work, which the exhibition has the title Dissonance and Disturbance, and we imagine if it was Matt's title that it was in order to shed light on just those themes. Out of the work, Iain and Astra, who I'll introduce in a second, and I'll have to read at that point, we've delimited three main themes: politics and the spectacle, democracy and technology, and forms of resistance. We're anticipating to spend around 15 minutes or so on each topic to leave enough time for more general and broad discussion at the end. Perhaps the big question to ask now is what, when, or where, if at all, might it be possible to coin a phrase of Stephen Duncombe, an ethical spectacle? Before we proceed any further, I'd like to introduce Iain Boal and Astra Taylor. And this is where, as I've said, I have to read, because their biographies are complicated and interesting. Iain is a social historian of science, techniques, and the commons, associated with the Retort Group. He is the author, together with T.J. Clarke, Joseph Matthews, and Michael Watts, of Retort's Afflicted Powers, Capital, and Spectacle in the New Age of War. He is co-editor of West of Eden, Communes and Utopia in Northern California, and author of The Green Machine, a concise history of the bicycle in planetary perspective. He is co-director of the Mayday Rooms, a syndicalist archiving from below initiative. He is affiliated with UC Berkeley and Birkbeck here in London. In 2005-06, he was a Guggenheim Fellow in Science and Technology and writes a column on art, technology, and image politics for SF MoMA's Open Space. Astra is a writer and documentary filmmaker. In 2006, she was named one of 25 new faces to watch in independent cinema by Filmmaker magazine. She's the director of two feature documentaries about philosophy, Zizek and Examined Life. She's the editor of Examined Life Excursions with Contemporary Thinkers and a co-editor of Occupy, Scenes from Occupied America, just out with Verso. Astra has also contributed to the Baffler, N+1, The Nation, Bomb, and other outlets. So if we can start with the first theme, politics and the spectacle, and think back to Guy Debord's contention that, and I quote, control over the image is now the key to social power, and his view that the real world is replaced by a selection of images which are projected above it, which at the same time succeed in making themselves regarded as the epitome of reality. I'd like to turn now to Iain, perhaps to kick off.
Yeah, well, thank you. This is behaving badly. Can you hear me? I'm going to project. Okay, good. Well, thank you all for coming, and thank you, Juliet, for moderating, and great to see Astra. I've known Astra a while, but this is the first time we've been on a stage together. I don't know if it's true that most of you have been upstairs to look at the Rhodes show, if I can put it that way. But it's very well worth seeing, and I'm going to reserve some remarks maybe at the third topic about how I think it might be useful for us in thinking about image politics. But maybe I can start, because I think I'm here because of the work that the Retort Group did on image politics 8 years ago now, perhaps. 7 or 8 years ago, when we decided that we couldn't go into the streets of San Francisco for the big marches on the eve of the war in 2003, and walk under the banner, the slogans that we were on offer. We knew that what they would be, namely peace and no blood for oil. The broadsheet that we produced, entitled Neither Their War Nor Their Peace, had at the top of it a reproduction of Guernica, which is a seriously interesting image, I think, for our purposes tonight, because, I mean, first of all, it's a history painting, and secondly, it still does seem to be able to do some real work in this very serious moment, historically. And we know that because at the moment when Colin Powell had to announce the impending bombardment of Baghdad, he came out of the security chamber, and the press was surprised, a lot of you will know this, to find a blue tarpaulin cast over the tapestry version of Guernica. Guernica itself had returned to Spain. Picasso wouldn't let it go back until fascism was gone. And this tapestry version was the backdrop to many press conferences. But it turned out that the explanation for the blue tarpaulin was that, well, the audience, the tapestry is a problem because there will be people in the audience who may get epileptic fits on account of the weave of the tapestry. This didn't wash with the press. They brought another senior person on and said, well, actually, the problem is the horse, you know. And that's interesting to think about that, because there's image fatigue, is there? Do we have image fatigue? It was considered a possibility that when another tranche of images from Abu Ghraib came out, that would somehow destabilize the state. Anyway, the broadsheet caused some interesting responses from all over, and so we sat down and we wrote a pamphlet which bloated into Afflicted Powers, which Verso published, Afflicted Powers. In a moment I'll just read, because I can't do any better, not just because I want to quote myself or ourselves, although no one else is probably going to, but because it condenses what I think we feel about spectacle, because I certainly don't want spectacle to be understood as somehow just a matter of images. Spectacle under current conditions comes out of the barrel of a gun and has to do with current forms of life, related very importantly to the techniques of reproduction and so on. It's interesting to ask the question, and it'll come back to Liz Rhodes on this, I think, because we found it interesting that nobody challenged the photographs that were coming out of Abu Ghraib, all right? In a world of, facticity and the manipulation, why did nobody challenge those photographs? Not the state didn't do it, nor did anybody. What would it mean? But we are going to have to face this evening, I think, the question of the veridical or verifiable. I want to come back later to an epithet that's around on the radio. I'm not watching this on TV at the moment, but listening to the radio here. The word unverifiable is all over the media concerning images coming out of homes, for example. So I think that's going to raise interesting questions. That, in fact, go back to the 17th century, the social history of truth, and whether truth is at stake here. Alan Sekula once said, not long ago, something, really interesting and important that we might think about tonight, which is that the photograph, the image, is challenged to the point now where it's not clear that it says anything true necessarily, that it's got nothing to say. The myth that it can't tell the truth. And I think that's not the case, but it's an interesting question to ask why and in what ways it is not the case. Let me just then read a short passage about the spectacle as we see it, what it amounts to, because it will not only talk about the image array, but about the field of the image under current conditions of spectacle, and in particular the field of reception, which includes us as audiences and interpolated subjects. Yes, so I think actually I've got... Can you still hear me? Okay, good. Here's what we said about spectacle. The notion of spectacle, and we're drawing, we think we're pulling, we were returning in a way to the very kind of practical, political use of spectacle. It had nothing to do with mediology, occult studies, but the work that was intended by Guy Debord and friends 40, 50 years ago. That it's a new form or a stage in the accumulation of capital. What it named preeminently was the submission of more and more facets of human sociability, areas of everyday life, forms of recreation, patterns of speech, idioms of local solidarity, kinds of ethical or authentic or aesthetic insubordination, the endless capacities of human beings to evade or refuse orders brought down to them from on high. And we'll get to this resistance question later. To the deadly solicitations, the lifeless, bright sameness of the market. Those who developed the analysis of the spectacle in the first place resisted the idea that this colonization of everyday life was dependent on any one set of technologies. But notoriously they were interested in the means modern societies have at their disposal to systematize and disseminate appearances, and to subject the texture of day-to-day living to a constant barrage of images, instructions, slogans, logos, false promises, virtual realities, miniature happiness motifs. Batteries not included, as the old punk band had it. I'll hand over to Astra now, but just before that, to say that one of the effects of these solicitations of the market, and of course the relationship to the state is very interesting, because the state, somewhat reluctantly, has been drawn willy-nilly into the micromanagement of everyday life. And of course the relationship between state and market is complex anyway. But I would just say that it's interesting that one of the effects that our new subjectivity, if you like, the modern subject, we argue, retort argues, is the production of, shall we say, weak citizens. That's to say, the texture of daily life, the forms of sociability have become thin. And the state finds it very hard to demand its citizens in the old way to go to to die and to kill for it, which is why I think we've got, not just for neoliberal expedience, why we've got Hessian-type mercenary armies, and why we have the new dronosphere, about which we should perhaps talk as well. The kind of the remote assassinations and so on. So that's what I mean by spectacle. And I want to come back later to make some more remarks about how I think the magnificent work of Liz Rhodes kind of relates to that. Astra, want to have a go?
Okay, go. Yeah, I was asking, well, first, thanks for coming, and thanks to Matt and everyone for being here. I was asking about the title of this series, The Trouble with Image Politics, and I was wondering why it was kind of getting under my skin, and then I realized as we were talking that it's because I'm sort of in a state of trouble. I'm troubled about the image of politics and whether to be a filmmaker and to keep doing films or whether to write, and so I feel like I'm actually almost in therapy talking about these issues, so I apologize. I'm not going to give you a sort of cohesive argument and articulate my position because a lot of this stuff is in question for me. And I'll be speaking, my experience is making 2 feature-length documentaries about philosophy and trying to figure out a way to present ideas using images on the big screen. But then more recently, for the last 5 months, just being absolutely immersed in Occupy Wall Street in New York and thinking more as an activist and somebody who's trying to make some sort of propaganda or represent the movement and convince other people to join in. And wondering about the sort of thinking about what's worked, what hasn't, and the movement is an interesting state without the camps now, where it's becoming more virtual and is becoming more of a spectacle. And it's operating in this as different spheres. So there's a kind of transition that I've been thinking about a lot. I want to go to the first quote from that Juliet read. Control over the image is now the key to social power. And one thing I've been really thinking about as a filmmaker is what does it mean to control the image in an age of social media when we all have access? Who's controlling the image when you can click on anything, when you can watch anything, when you can say into your iPhone, I want to watch Astra Taylor's Examine Life on Netflix and not whatever's on television. So what is the control that we're talking about there? This sort of mythology of our time, right, is that now we're free media consumers. We can watch whatever we want. We can do whatever we want. And so we're in this transition. A lot of us, I think, on the left, and a lot of filmmakers are still caught up in a sort of old media critique, a kind of old school Chomskyan idea of the broadcasters manufacturing consent and we resist them, the broadcasters and the advertisers, and that sort of media control emanates from above, and we are outside of that. Obviously, the media sphere is much more complicated now. It's participatory. We're all engaged in it, and so I think we kind of need to update that conception. The other kind of control that comes to mind is the authorial control, the author having control over their images and what they've made, and that's also kind of in flux now with all the talk of remixing and repurposing and. It's harder as an author to control the context over which your work is shown. You make a film and then you want it shown at the ICA, but immediately it's on YouTube, it's cut into bits, it's mixed with advertising, it's this and that, so the author has also less control. But like a lot of people who are attracted to documentary filmmaking or journalism, I think there's still this part of me that believes in this old-fashioned, the power of the image. If I could just reveal the truth of something, then there would be change. The Noam Chomsky idea. Actually, they would just, if the broadcasters would just stop distorting the narrative and tell people the facts, then we could see and we could understand, and there would, things would be righted. Or as we were discussing that we were lifelong, but we've been vegetarians for a long time. If slaughterhouses only had glass walls, then everybody would eat their greens like we do. So this idea that the image undistorted could change things. And so I constantly have to remind myself that actually that's naive, that's not the case, that things are more complicated than that. And one framework I found that's really helpful for shifting my perspective is Jodi Dean's conception of communicative capitalism. Has anybody read her work? And this idea that we are actually in a very different kind of moment and living in this ideological formation that sort of fetishizes speech and participation and spectacle, and this idea that actually we're constantly enjoined to add images to the mix and circulate them, and sure, tell the truth. It'll just go into that endless flow of stuff that's out there. And intellectually, I'm sort of captivated by her argument about the way things are described. As an activist and as an artist or a documentary filmmaker, then you go, well, what the hell am I supposed to do, right? Where do I intervene into this mess? And so that's why these questions are so alive for me and so kind of confusing as I figure out what the next step is. And I want to sort of jump a little bit forward, and sort of share something. How's the time going? She's gonna go on, it's good. Okay. Yeah?
You're going into the next theme.
I'm going to the next theme, okay. I'm gonna brace myself. Maybe we'll just stop. Should we do it?
No,
Soundbite world.
It is a soundbite world. I guess wanted to share this because I think this kind of gets to the heart of the issue I'm wrestling with. I was buying some coffee this morning. I looked at the newspaper and it said that the riot police are going to get water cannons. Did you all see this in the headlines? Yeah, it said here in London, the police are going to be given hoses to deal with the next, group of rioters. And that struck me because I had been thinking a lot about the idea of the ethical spectacle, which Stephen Duncombe brings up. And when I read that the police were going to be given hoses, I immediately thought of the civil rights movement in the United States and the fact that one reason that protesters in the US and Occupy Wall Street has not been hosed is that the image of protesters being hosed was so troubling when it was projected, when it was on the cover of all the newspapers, that they decided that's going too far. We won't hose people down. We live in a moment where every protester at Occupy Wall Street, for example, has a camera and is photographing themselves and what's happening to them. And so we've got all of these images circulating of people being pepper sprayed, point blank, pepper sprayed in the mouth. And yet there's absolutely no sign that pepper spray is going to be retired by the police force in the United States of America. So I think that's an interesting, I found that kind of an interesting example. One powerful image a generation ago, and there was a shift. We've got millions of images now of this egregious act, and if anything, they're just spending more and more money on their less lethal weaponry to make us go home. So with that, that's my segue.
At risk of trivializing what you've said,
Yeah.
there's also to be a hosepipe ban.
To be a what?
A ban on people hosepiping their garden because of a water shortage. Now we know why.
That should do it.
Yeah.
Maybe people have some direct questions, or do you want to keep them for the...
No. Clarifications.
Okay, then swiftly on to the next.
Segue in. Yeah.
The next theme, which I think Astrid has beautifully anticipated, but I want to remind us of Walter Benjamin, who I think even a long time before Guy Debord argued that technology is not some sort of prosthetic arm, that it is a way of organizing experience. And in the light of what you've been describing, Astrid, and Astra, and the associations that perhaps are somewhat automatic now between democracy and new media and telephone and internet communications, what types of experience are being solicited? What sort of subjects do you think are being called into place through these technologies?
Well, one thing, I think the issue, it's what does the technology make possible? It makes possible constant broadcasting, and so I think one phenomenon that your comments about Benjamin reminded me of is the way people who have sort of absorbed this idea that the media distorts, the broadcasters, the advertisers, the MSM, as we like to say, distorts reality. One way to combat that is to constantly reveal oneself, through the constant projection of images. And so within the Occupy movement, there's this phenomenon of live streaming, nonstop, 24 hours a day live streaming, as if you can just sort of reveal the unadulterated truth by constant image making. And I find that a sort of fascinating issue. It's like, you want to sort of, there's this sort of paradox of recognizing the way the media distorts, but then also the solution then is more media. And if you are always on, then there will be constant truth. So I think that's one kind of subject that's called into being, is the subject who is supposedly transparent and open and always on. And as far as the political efficacy of that, one question is, well, does that burn people out? Is there an audience who really wants to watch the always-on protesters 24 hours a day? I don't think so. I think we need to be a bit more strategic in our media making.
Yeah, okay. Technology and democracy, okay. I won't use technology because it's been reduced to iPods or something. Technics. For me, the question is the ensemble of human artifacts and these prosthetic extensions, and they're being embedded in the world. In some sense, we get the techniques we deserve. Historians of technology are very prone to looking at sort of the past as prologue. The way the world is was determined by the sort of internal evolution of these various sort of machines. We could ask why, when telephony started, it was, and for 100 years was just a dyadic operation mostly. Why was it not for community from the beginning? Technically, it could have been. There are all these kinds of questions about technology in general. Let me just make a kind of strong claim, although it's a sort of complex one. Both liberal and left Marxist accounts of the prosthetic artifactual world claim in general that the technologies, that techniques are neutral. For liberals, there's kind of good uses and bad uses. It's not so easy to see that in the case of a cruise missile, but, in general, with a knife you can cut bread or you can kill someone. It's just a question of good uses or bad uses. And in a way, the typical Marxist account has been the same, except it's just the technologies are in the wrong hands. If we could unfetter them from capitalists or bad guys. And typically, again, invoking kind of the Chomskyan business, a lot of sort of left media has been exercised mainly to taking them as neutral to simply get sort of their stuff or our stuff down the pipes. Okay, either let's try to fight as much as we can for sort of community television, for example, or public radio. And then in the Chomskyan mode, we can just tear the mask off power. So he's the last great Enlightenment thinker. That's the truth will do it, you know. And that's an inadequate position, right? I think, let me say a couple of things about that. One is that I don't believe that techniques, in that sense, are neutral. Nor are they determinative. They don't. You're not forced into a particular sort of subject position by your telephone. I mean, it's very hard not to fall into the pacings and protocols of the way that the techniques are arranged in front of you, say in your personal apparatus. If you're standing in front of a bank machine, you're very impatient as you go through, but you're forced into their rhythms. Who is they? Well, they're the anonymous people who brought you the ATM. Same with the internal combustion engine. It's a kind of individualizing power pack. We're all alone together on the freeway. It has a different kind of sociability, the motor car, than the bicycle. I'm a kind of bicycle historian. The bicycle is a lovely. It brought the world the beautiful phrase freewheeling. That comes from cycling, right? And we know it was an instrument of liberation for women clerks and in general people who weren't able to make unchaperoned movement in any serious way. It was unchaperoned mobility, and it was a liberating machine. But working with the rickshaw pullers in India, don't tell me that it's a liberation technology. 16 hours a day, one gear, sleeping on your tricycle. No, although a lot of these pullers would prefer that than other options. But it all depends. Same with the computer and its how freeing that is. Well, tell that to the data entry neo-slaves with digital palsy who are entering, you know. So it all depends in that sense on the context. There's a beautiful folk phrase which captures what happens with respect to, for example, television. There's a thing called the televisual body, which we all know because we know what is meant by the word couch potato. There's a low-grade depression produced. And I'm not just talking about the sort of phenomenology, the difference between, say, a cathode ray machine and film projection, which is important, and Deleuze is quite right that we should take that absolutely seriously, not to fetishize at the molecular level, but the phenomenology of it and what it does to our bodies. It's not enough just to get the good stuff down the pipes. And that's why I think Liz Rhodes is so interesting to look, because she's had this long career. And the challenging, the formalist move, like the modernist move she makes upstairs in Dresden, you know, that's beautiful and important, right? Yes, it concentrates us on the medium. We're brought back to consciousness comes, yeah, this is stuff. It's celluloid. This is hot metal type. This is, yeah, you know. Let's look at the form. Let's think about the medium, and that is powerful. But it's got a sell-by date, or has it? I mean, maybe I'll just stop here and we can have a bit of an exchange now, but get to questions of resistance. Because is there still image making against the spectacle possible? I would hope so, but it's extremely hard. I'm not sure that contemporary artists are getting at it much. Certainly none better than Rhodes, I would have to say. I found that going upstairs, it was a kind of inoculation, briefly, in its pacings and rhythm. against what I read on Sunday was the new sort of editing style, which apparently has reached the point where I think in the Bourne Ultimatum, the average cut is it's around 2 seconds now. So in that sense, the slow film is might do some work in terms of image politics, but don't be sure about it because it's going to be appropriated, right? This is, the most poignant kind of move of the 20th century was the fond hope by surrealists that they would be able to detonate a revolution simply by making the kind of images they did. Could they have anticipated that this would simply be the lexicon of Madison Avenue? Well, I don't know. I think a huge honor is due to Liz Rhodes' work, that she's able, for me at least, homeopathic doses of what's happening up there would work, because it doesn't last. I mean, right? I used to say that, going off on a holiday, you'd say, I've seen this, it's a completely different world, and it lasts about 6 weeks. You're back into the old rhythms. This is back to the kind of the fact that spectacle is about the way in which more and more areas of daily life are colonized in this way. And we're talking fundamentally now about the techniques of dissemination and image making, but I would say exactly the same thing about the technologies of communication. The way the street has been enclosed, the evacuation of the street for the demands of circulation under capital. It's all been normalized, but it was a huge struggle. It took 2 generations to make that happen, between about 1880 and 1930. The motor car was a tremendous intrusion, as indeed were the very first bicycles. They were stopped in their tracks by pedestrians in the 1820s, and the bicycle disappeared for 2 generations. Now cyclists think that they have a technology that somehow antithesis of the motor car. Nonsense. Not vis-a-vis pedestrians. And so we've got to do some really hard thinking about the particular techniques, and not to fetishize them. I honor Astra for making philosophy films. My God, how hard is that? But again, when we come back to this last theme, the field of reception is important. What kinds of subjects are we now? I fear, and this is what T.J. Clark said recently in a talk that he gave, that I organized at Birkbeck on the Luddites. He said that maybe Nietzsche was right. Actually, we modern subjects, precisely because of what De Boer feared, we are not capable of society in the old way. Again, not to be nostalgic in some, reactionary way for the past, but we are bad subjects for this kind of society that we want. Which is why I think when we come on to the Occupy question, and whether image making is what we need to be doing against spectacle, or rather actually getting our bodies in the squares and so on. Last note before we move back. For me, interested in traffic and circulation and the spaces of capital, it was really fascinating. If any of you have been to Cairo, you know that to get into Tahrir Square is an act of madness or desperation across, it would be like trying to run across in Hyde Park Corner, against the lights sort of thing. It's extremely dangerous. You either have to, you don't know how to do it. You either just walk steadily across, but it's like maybe 8, 10, like traffic. Stopping the traffic was the precondition for democracy in that space. And in the days they held it, the circulation stopped. When they heard the sound of cars and trucks coming in the square, that was the sound of the counter-revolution. You weren't expecting me to come and talk about traffic here, right? Because we don't think about it. It's so normalized now that no one ever thought, why don't we stop the traffic going around St. Paul so those of us in the 10th University can hear what Massimo d'Angelis, the great Italian communist and professor of political economy in London here, gave his magnificent speech at the beginning of the occupation in London. Almost couldn't hear him above the traffic noise. But we could. Things are going to be difficult. That's the tough work that needs to be done.
Thanks. So our final theme, which both speakers have touched upon, is sites of resistance. And I'm struck I'm not sitting in front of Picasso tapestry of Guernica, but the destruction of El Baida flour mill in Gaza in January 209, which is a still from one of the films of that.
You can maybe leave that.
Oh, yes, of Liz Rhodes. But we're bearing that in mind, in full cognizance of that fact, how do we think through the problematics of resistance in relation to your analysis of the spectacle, your work as a filmmaker, and now perhaps the temptation of shifting away from that form of practice to direct action?
I wish I knew whether what Iain said was true about the reception of Liz Rhodes' film. I wonder if at the time that Dresden Dynamo came out, if it was actually very jarring and, you know, talking about the pace of her film seems so slow and sort of soothing and antidote to today's rapid media, but did it appear that way at the time? I'd like to know what they felt like when they were new and fresh.
Sorry, it wasn't. I wasn't talking about the pacings of it so much, but the sort of the reflexiveness of it in the modernist mode. I mean, we know what happened. You know, farewell to an idea. You know, to modernism in that way. That what it was capable of and what it wasn't. Anyway, yeah. Sorry.
Yeah. Oh, okay. So, yeah, I hear you. I mean, I guess, you know, and one other thing that your comments brought up was this idea. You know, is spectacle in our way, or is there sort of a reality out there that's being distorted, being blurred, or something like that? And going back again to one of the quotes that we began with. Real world is replaced by a selection of images which are projected above it, yet which at the same time succeed in making themselves regarded as the epitome of reality. And so that's why I brought up this tendency within the Occupy Wall Street movement of activists today. And I think it's a broader ideology of this moment, the ideas of openness and transparency that, okay, well, we'll just reveal everything and escape this mediation, this thing that blocks reality and then becomes the epitome of reality. That somehow images are inauthentic or something like that. We need to get to the authentic, and that if we're open and transparent, then we'll have this authenticity. And I wrestled with this a lot as I was making my 2 documentary films, and trying to figure out how to represent people's personalities, people's ideas, and what was authentic. And what I eventually came to was this idea that it's not about following them with a camera 24 hours a day for months and months and months on end, so I get those moments like what does the philosopher look like when they first roll out of bed and they've got some, you know, crust on their face and they're off guard and groggy, but rather trying to create an encounter where a different kind of truth would come out, the truth of what they think and what their views are and their ideas, even if it was even if there was a lot of artifice. And so this to me is the idea of the ethical spectacle. And perhaps if I try to put on my optimist hat, one way out, one way forward, one way that I can still figure out how to engage with all of these problems and issues that we're discussing. I think that's it.
Yeah. Liz Rhodes' work is instructive, I think, because it reminds us that in all looking there is a whole slew of conventions, presuppositions that that are used by power to manipulate and control. But there are limits. That was really the heart of afflicted powers. We asked the question, is it true that this new mix of techniques of dissemination communication that the state willy-nilly dragged into, as I say, the management of politics, and is it true that that real destabilization, that the use by those resisting can destabilize using those means? And we argued that indeed the US imperium suffered a defeat at the level of spectacle when those aviators, refunctioning the bombers that had been refunctioned into tourist planes, when they refunctioned them back into bombers, hit the Twin Towers. I mean, it was brilliant. Of course, no communique was issued. Why? Because in a sense they were masters of spectacle. They understood, particularly when the second one hit, that there then would be many cameras on the fact that it wasn't just this one kind of nullity, this big monstrous block, but there was another one too. So it raises the question, what are the possibilities, given the ensemble, the technical means to hand, to create real destabilization? And I think the position that we come to is that certainly they're to be deployed, but not naively. We must understand, and then techniques don't determine social relations. But what I would say is that they all have their own, and this is not sort of predictable in advance. People who invent these things are always outrunning the uses of the inventors, right? Take any of the technologies that we might want to talk about that to do with image making. They don't determine at all, and nobody quite knows whether they're going to sell, how they're going to do. But there is what I call a value slope. That's to say, back to the question of the television, there's a kind of televisual body that's produced in the form, right? There's a kind of tendential social relations that are set up by the arrangement of this room, and that's fine. We might, it's fine for me that there's an audience facing me. We're on a raised diet. That's a responsibility. Certain things are harder to do than when you're round in a circle. The kind of sociability that's possible on to use the old example I'm using, on a bicycle is different. It's not that there is no sociability in a motor car, but the kind of blight that it produces in the bow wave and the speed, it makes it much, much harder. So I think we just have to attend to these things. And is there nothing that would be an explosive image? Is there anything like Guernica that we could imagine now? Art making against war that could have that kind of power now? And is that to do with the failure of artists to do that? Or is it something else? If we say it might not be easy or even impossible to detonate a massive anti-war movement. Because for sure these unverified handheld images coming out of Homs are horrifying enough. Is that what we think should be happening? Trying to make that detonation.
Well, one thing that's fascinating about so many of the images that have come out of the war, though, is that they've been self-produced. They've been glory, photos of glory that the soldiers are taking themselves. There were the kill photos in Afghanistan that soldiers were taking, Abu Ghraib, of course. So these are also photos that artists and activists have nothing to do with. Even journalists haven't made them, right? They're photos that have a completely different resonance for the people who took them than the people who see them. And so are those the images that shock the most? People who are not anticipating a global audience and in their unthinkingness reveal something about themselves that troubles the world. So I think that's an interesting thing. I mean, if you go back to the sort of key images of the Vietnam War, those were master photographers, war journalists taking them, not idiot soldiers who were having a good time and playing with their cell phones. I think that's quite interesting. Your comments on September 11th are interesting to me because I was actually downtown on September 11th that morning. I was one of the only times I went to work going to work early that morning. So I was about 9 blocks away with my little brother who was 16, who was going to his first day in internship. It was so interesting having the experience of that event, and then almost exactly a decade later, the first day of Occupy Wall Street, being in the shadow of the Freedom Tower, which is the ultimate symbol. I mean, it's the ultimate attempt to assert freedom and democracy in the American style over the city. And to be there on that first day, and the way that your definition of their spectacle, them, understanding that there needed to be the second plane so it would be transmitted over cameras, but there was still the real effect, of course, of the buildings falling and the horror of that day and everything that transpired afterwards. The thing about the events of Occupy Wall Street and why it was such a breath of fresh air in New York was that it was at once a very astute, people were quite astute about using spectacle and using social media, but it was also a total repudiation of everything to do with mediation and saying, no, we will sit in a park and cook for each other and talk to each other and do things as inefficiently as humanly possible. And so I think it's almost being a spectacle inadvertently. There was something happening there, and the spectacle was interwoven, not leading with image that was so interesting. I also, as a filmmaker, I was struck that day that part of why the images transmitted and why they were so appealing is that people were shooting with their computers, not even with cameras or iPhones, so they were holding them down below. So at about 3 feet, which is how I shot Slavoj Žižek in my film. I had hired a very short camera person because when you look up, things look impressive, you're odd. And so all the footage of this first couple of days is shot by these people holding, almost at hip level, these computers, and it made things look much more epic and intense and cool than it actually was. It was really kind of, not much was happening the first couple of days, but the way the image was projected, it cast a much larger shadow than what was actually going on. So,
which is a reprise in a way of Liz's this superb, very poignant film about Gaza and the destruction of the flour mill, and the way in which, in Kettle as well, the choice of angle and picture is it's highly sophisticated. I'm not against the collective, subvalence and the Rodney King effect and all that we need, and of course Power knows that, again, this is one of the ways it can be destabilized. The fact that it was a kind of junior bankster holding out his thing that got, Tomlinson, I forget, how that exactly worked, but it was somebody, without that image in a way, that still there is a kind of a truth effect. Back to Sakula's point, right? The myth that the camera tells lies, tells the truth, has been replaced by the myth that it doesn't. I mean, there is still, but we cannot continue anymore just to take the Chomskyan position or just the institutional critique. We have to think about, as I say, and that would be my thought here, the whole field. And if you're persuaded by in a way it doesn't come out in the quote from Guy that you had there. It's not really just to do with, you know, the panoptic or the above or the control. It's to do with what it does to us as well. Can
we open up?
Yeah,
Yes,
we got. Is there energy for an exchange? Yeah, let's go for it, shall we?
Yeah.
Astra.
I'm struck by the focus on the image here. I think really...
Well, sorry, we're in the wrong place. That's just the topic.
Are you also working effectively in terms of language or in terms of data? Because I think it's like the way in which people's personal data is being used over the internet as a means of constructing an image of that person to sell it. I mean, if you look at the amount of data being collected now, and in terms of commercial surveillance data is astronomical.
Mm-hmm.
The models that are being produced of people, of us.
Yeah.
And the reason I wanted to go on to say that there was quite an interesting article on the Reggae this morning about some animal rights activists who have effectively stopped the transportation of animals into the country from scientific experiments. The interesting thing about it is that they refused to speak to the voices, which is another tactic which is related to the other side of the tactic that you were talking about in relation to the occupied. Silence also works.
Mm-hmm.
If you don't cooperate, you don't cooperate with it on that kind of basis either.
Yeah. We could take some
Take a
more.
few
We could.
comments.
I'd like, while I remember, just to go at that, and then maybe we could take a batch of them.
Okay.
Just because a couple of points. Yeah. Okay.
Yeah.
Forgive us for talking about the image. It's just
No,
the sign under which we're gathered tonight.
Was the assignment.
But thank you for what you said. That's very important. And we could call it an image that, you know, that with my history of science hat on, the avalanche of numbers, it was called. You know, the invention of statistics. The word state is barely disguised in the word statistics. The arithmetic of the state reached a point around 1800 where there was a kind of an avalanche of these things. And we're now very used to population thinking in kind of a Malthusian way. And that is hugely important. That kind of abstraction, the sort of the demographic abstraction, is of course one of the purposes of the state and so on. And we are thinking like a state when we think in population terms. Yeah, that's a hugely important, but I think not exactly, you know, the question that we can grapple with right now, but I think that's right. The silence, yes, of course, silence has always been a weapon of the weak, and people are called stupid, you know, the Irish were always called dumb and stupid because they didn't speak to their English masters. And it's one of the reasons I never, in a classroom when I'm teaching, I never insist that people speak, because that's the liberal move. And of course, we want spaces where people feel comfortable when there's asymmetries of power and you have grades. Of course, you want that. But to insist that somebody speaks, that is, the right to silence is a very important, hard-won right. It's in that sense, it's a proletarian victory, and we must defend it, absolutely, the right to silence. And to keep quiet, of course, and is important when you know what the media are going to do to it. But that's a huge topic.
Any more comments, questions?
There's one over there, and then okay, and then off to the back.
Thanks. Very interesting debate, conversation. I was wondering about where you've talked eloquently about images in themselves. If there's some things you could possibly say about image structures. So there's a young Englishman potentially being deported or extradited to the US for copyright infringement or potential copyright infringement. And that seems to be where there's a deliberate antagonism, a kind of line of demarcation which is very explicit and has implications for state and corporate power. And so, like, rather than maybe, or as well as thinking about the transformatory effects of image in itself, and maybe thinking of the Rodney King image, the videos of that violence by state power, and how that brought together a community. It said we are not just witnessing this, we have been subjected to it ourselves, so we can align ourselves to this, and then we'll demonstrate our kind of emotive response. And we're going to react now because something has stood in place for our experience. Whereas the images we've broadly been thinking about maybe tonight stand in for knowledge.
Standing for the...
Stand in for knowledge. So they may transform our thinking, but they don't necessarily transform our actions. So Rodney King as an image transformed actions. It stood for people's experience, not everyone's, but some people within that population. It stood for their experience and it aided their transformation. Whereas generally speaking, it didn't speak for most people. So generally speaking, they didn't react to it. I think we're asking for a universal from a particular, if you like. When we're talking about image as surface, it won't do everything for everyone. Whereas something like image as structure, looking at copyright as a kind of state instantiated mode of operating within capital, then there are real implications and it becomes much more universal because we exist under those laws globally.
Yeah, it's interesting what you're saying. I can't help but connect your comment to actually the gentleman's comment before about data and flows, because I actually have mixed feelings about the copyright issue. It's something that is at once a kind of, there's the left-wing critique of copyright as property. There's also the libertarian critique, which is that copyright tells me what I can and can't do with my property, so it shouldn't exist. And a lot of Silicon Valley libertarians are really against copyright, and because their business models, the data harvesters depend on the free flow of information and this and that. So I have a kind of, I think that as we move through this media transition into this new age, the copyright thing is an interesting example. It's something that's being fought over by different interests and groups, and it's not to me clear. There are different critiques of copyright to be made. I'm saying I think that that's a little bit debatable where the interests stand.
Just a word before the question over there. The copyright structural. I would just say that that's a whole topic we could spend, of course, many evenings on. The image politics in relation to ownership. And I would just say again, it's a question of the social relations, the sociality of knowledge making, which is hidden by capital and its legal forms. The shock in the academy in California when we were, as teachers, invited to regard our courseware. We'd never heard the word courseware. As ours, and that we should copyright it. Any syllabus, of course, is a social production. So for me, to put my cards on the table, what we have to do is to go commoning. we have to create community. Will come out of commons. Community is a word that, as Kenneth Burke said, it's like excrement on the tongue. How can you say community? It's so devalued. It's disgusting. But the fact is that the enclosures of the image are going ahead. My comrade Gray Brecking wrote a wonderful book on the history of San Francisco, Imperial San Francisco. So it would now be, this is just 10 years later, completely impossible to have written the book because of the new copyright laws and libraries becoming, profit centers. So we absolutely have to push back on that front, quite apart from the kind of the structural question, which is, I take your point, and thank you for saying that. I think maybe take another.
Yeah, it's just a comment really. Something that Astra was saying about the sort of continuous broadcasting of the Occupy movement. Just sort of as a corollary of that was whether it's effectual or not is a different thing, but during the recent Russian elections, one of the policies that they kind of introduced to counteract fraud was that they were live web screening all of the election booths and the voting machines, and it was something that came up very rapidly was that protesters were watching these live feeds and they were recording, and so very rapidly on YouTube and Vimeo and things, there were kind of films of computer screens showing electoral fraud happening in these kind of voting booths. Whether it was effectual or not, because it's consumed and that maybe just the gesture enough was to say, we have webcams in all of the voting booths, so no electoral fraud can happen, because obviously it didn't change the result. But it's something that, and maybe it's key with the Occupy movement, is whichever side you're on, whoever has a vested interest in watching these things is watching, and they'll be using that information either publicly or privately.
Yeah, I think that's interesting. So the authorities were actually doing the videotaping of the voting booths.
Yeah, to sort of counter accusations of fraud, they said that they'd put webcams in all of the in all of the voting booths, so you could see the sort of 24-hour, however long the voting period was open, you could see a live screen of every kind of voting place in the country.
Interesting. Yeah, one thing, in an analogous fashion, Occupy is also broadcasting its own mistakes, at least in New York, where, you'll tune into the live stream and somebody's getting punched in the face at the General Assembly or something. So, your own, the tool that's supposed to reveal that's supposed to convince other people to join your cause or believe in you can sometimes backfire.
Yeah, thanks for that. That's really interesting and important. I'd just add that I flashed on that, it reminded me of some very overheated expectations about Al Jazeera. I mean, back to Astra's point about the Vietnam War. The American state planners really didn't pay any attention to the photographs that have been considered very powerful and somehow triggering maybe the... I think it's probably not true that the images were that important, domestically even. Mostly it was the citizen draft army refusing to fight, I think, did it. But there was resistance at home. But they didn't really, they paid no attention to the reception of these images in Indochina and the global south at that time. Now they do. That's part of our case in Afflicted Powers, that the terms have changed. And Rumsfeld gave this extraordinary talk, some of you might remember, to the press club in Washington, in which he was wringing his hands, saying, we're so far behind the curve. It's a 24/7 world. iPhones. We're just limping along behind. We've got to get up to speed. A kind of highly vulgarized version of spectacle. So, surveillance. All these forms. It's interesting. The state certainly has to pay attention to it. As I say, whether serious destabilization is possible on these terms, I don't know. It's still worth trying. Yeah, please.
It may slightly be going off the point, and it's quite a simple question to ask, but a lot of people are saying that the Coney 2012 campaign is like to take away from, there's a lot of conspiracy theories about it basically, and to take away from the Occupy movement. I'm just interested in what you actually think of this campaign. Or if you've even heard of it.
Me? I'm ignorant.
About what?
Coney 2012.
Yeah.
About who? Who is he? been on the internet for 10 days. So. If it's from the last 10 days, I've been away. It's
So the question is whether that's whether they conspired to do that.
So what your opinion is, basically?
I don't think he's voting for him.
Well, I mean, thank you. It's a good. No, I mean, it's another example, right? I mean, on what terms it, was actually arranged or undone. It's another version of the problem that obviously the question that we posed here. We don't quite know how to get out of this. Obviously, for example, some things have to be scotomized, can't be shown. We were not allowed to see the image, for example, of bin Laden's body. That immediately raises, in terms of image politics, an important issue of verifiability. The planners of the raid, they need evidence. If there's no body itself, bring us the body, habeas corpus. Why were we not allowed to see that image? All we were allowed to see was in the room in the White House where they're watching the raid. They just see an image of that, so it's kind of a second-hand thing. So obviously they're still aware that there's the power of these kinds of intervention images to make a difference, and that was always the hope. For example, that that further images from Guantanamo or wherever would in that sense make a difference. But it's as I say, I think it's a much deeper structural question. Not that it can't happen, but it's very difficult.
I think we're getting signals to wind down. Should we take one quick comment?
I would like to ask regarding this term, the ethical spectacle. On what ethics is that spectacle based on? I think, in a way, when you look at it, it's like it's in a way the police or the state using the ethical spectacle because they use pepper spray and not tear gas, because tear gas looks more like war, and pepper spray is actually more painful than tear gas, but it doesn't look like war.
Better.
So I think there's a question about ethics here. I think in a way it's like quite bourgeois idea, in a way, staying in the square, not stopping the traffic, like believing in some kind of reason or some kind of ethics that are like embedded in society as such. So in a way, I think I think the matter must be somehow to obstruct the spectacle and not just somehow create like the good version. Or in a way, that's a question to you now. You're using this term.
Yeah, I agree. As we were talking about it, I had the same thought that it depends whose ethics, and obviously that's a term that can be used by anyone. And Stephen Duncombe, who we're taking that phrase from, his position is sort of evident in the book. The master of the ethical spectacle for him is Martin Luther King, who initially did his actions in Albany, Georgia, and the police commissioner there was like, "Oh, I studied Gandhi too. I do nonviolent policing," and so nothing happened. There was no confrontation. They went to jail, And then he moved to Selma, and there was Bull Connor, and they knew they'd get a rise out of this guy, and that these images would be broadcast and change the world. So this idea that Martin Luther King sought out confrontation, but he did it in such a way that the audience would, interpret and they would see an injustice. Or there's another famous story where a photographer puts down his camera to help somebody who's getting beaten by a cop, and Martin Luther King says, "Don't do that, you have to photograph us." Disrupting the spectacle, I think that only gets us so far. I think, and also I think that is the ideology of our moment, right? This idea that we're all remixers, we're all curators, we're all mashup artists, we're all DJs, we're all disrupting the flow and adding to the mix or something like that. So more disrupting of the spectacle seems like more spectacle to me. So I like, maybe I'm still can attach this idea of creating something else that's not just disrupting, but you know, it's a real challenge right now. For example, to use Occupy, this will be my sort of last anecdote, but there are these videos circulating that people in the direct action group I think are very rousing, and it's about nonviolent resistance, but it's just videos of people blowing up property, cars exploding, and windows being smashed, and that's very rousing to them. It's alienating to a lot of other people, so you have to think about, you know, Juliet calls it symbolic efficacy. Like, you know, do people have the same interpretation as you when they're watching your spectacle, or are you actually doing more harm than good? If your ultimate goal is not just to create an image, but to change the world or change people's behavior with it, then you have to think about how it's being interpreted at the other end. Otherwise, you might alienate your supporters. So
I'll leave the last words to Liz Rhodes. It's dangerous to step out of line, but lethal not to. And I think both our speakers here tonight constantly are pirouetting on one side of the quagmire and another, and hopefully will never stay in one place on either side of this troubling image, or troubled image, or what was your other dialectical point?
I'm troubled.
I'm troubled. So thank both of our speakers very much.
Well, thanks